Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the historicity of Jesus in our continuing study of the life of Christ. When we approach the historicity of Jesus, we are confronted with two possible presuppositions. That is, the existence of the supernatural versus those who essentially deny the supernatural even exists. Both sides agree that the supernatural is not the norm. In other words, supernatural things don't happen all the time. That's what makes them supernatural. They're not regular, they're not natural, they're supernatural. And so when we look at events in history, when we look at these events in history, we can take one of two assumptions. If we assume the existence of the supernatural, then that event might or it might not be supernatural. In other words, it might be a supernatural event, but since supernatural events are not the norm, we first look to see, is it just a natural event? It might appear fortuitous, it might appear just by chance, but is it a natural event that took place? Of course, those who deny the supernatural are going to assume it can't be supernatural because they've started with that presupposition. They've started with that assumption. Samuel Ramaris says it was then clearly not the intention or the object of Jesus to suffer and to die, but to build up a worldly kingdom and to deliver the Israelites from bondage. He's showing his presuppositions. He's just assuming something's the case, certainly not based upon the biblical text. David Strauss says the supernatural birth of Christ, his miracles, his resurrection and ascension remain eternal truths. Now, if you stopped right there, you'd say, okay, he's assuming that those things are true. But notice, they remain eternal truths. Whatever doubts may be cast on their reality as historical facts. He's saying it doesn't really matter whether it really happened, it's still a truth. And I think what he's doing is redefining what truth is. He's got a different definition of truth than I would. And so we're left with the Jesus of history versus what some have claimed to be the Christ of faith, and a contrast between the two. For the evangelical Christian, I would suggest that they are one and the same, that the Jesus of history is the Christ of faith, that we have not believed what John the Apostle calls cunningly devised fables. We have embraced that which is really true, the Jesus of history. Now, the Jesus Seminar came out in the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, and it was made up of liberal scholars and even more liberal laymen. And they had a panel where they were using colored beads to vote on which portions of the gospel were deemed historical. And they assumed that any statement made by Jesus about himself was not authentic, that others had put words into his mouth. So I look at, sometimes you hear about scholarship believes. I think they came with their presuppositions fully packed and loaded. And so when we're looking for the real Jesus, all sorts of ideas have been presented. The urban myth that he's just a Jewish sage, that he was a failed prophet, a Jewish teacher, a magician, a social prophet, sort of a cynic, a philosopher. The feminists has their own spin on who Jesus is. And many of these are in conflict with one another. C.S. Lewis, apologist in the mid-20th century, suggested there's one of four approaches you can take to who Jesus is. First, you can insist that he was merely a legend, that he had no basis at all in truth. And there are few historians that are willing to even suggest such an idea, that Jesus is only a legend. And we're going to see the reason why is because we actually have not just Christian records, and of course they have to be dealt with, but we also have non-Christian testimony of Jesus as well. So to take him as a legend just doesn't work very well. To say that he is a lunatic because Jesus said some things about himself that a normal person would not say if they were not true. So was Jesus a legend? Lewis dismisses that. was he saying things about himself that he was equal with God, that he was in the beginning with God, that he had, that before Abraham existed, he is, things like that, that if you were in your right mind, you wouldn't say. And yet when you listen to the teaching of Jesus, he strikes you not only as being in his right mind, but as being the most sane person who ever walked the earth. His teachings smack of true sanity. So was he a liar? You see, either he was a legend, a lunatic, or a liar, because he said things about himself. He said things he was able to do. He gave evidences for those things through his supernatural power, through his miracles. And he spoke about the importance of having truth. So was this all made up? And again, I would point to his ethical system, which smacks of complete honesty. Was he a liar? And I would say absolutely not. He set up a system of ethics that few of us have lived up to completely. I would say none of us have lived up to completely, that calls for true truth. And so, no, not a legend, not a lunatic, not a liar. And Lewis suggests then you have only one alternative, that he is indeed Lord. He is who he claimed to be. Luke's account starts off, and we've looked at this already, Luke chapter 1, beginning verse 1, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, and you notice he's saying that others have already done this work of writing out an account. Verse 2, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Notice he's saying he's not the first and he's not an eyewitness. These things were handed down to him and to others. Verse 3, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth. Notice the emphasis on truth. The exact truth about the things you have been taught. And so Luke does the work of a historian, a careful historian, a research historian who has weighed the evidence, who has weighed the different accounts, and is bringing this work of research to our eyes. Now, you have both the accounts of Christians regarding Jesus and what he accomplished, but we're going to see there are also accounts from non-Christians. With regard to the accounts from Christians, we have those in the four Gospels, although Luke is alluding to other things that had been written that became at least his sources. But you go from the four Gospels, they were written in the first century. Now, when we get to the second and third and fourth centuries, we have other writings like the Gnostic writings. I'm also going to add that we have writings of both apostolic and early church fathers, but they are derived mostly from the four Gospels. They're just taking the four Gospels and passing that information along. The Gnostic writers, they're actually trying to insert their own teachings into the person and work of Jesus, but they don't come before the four Gospels. They are all writing later, and indeed in a number of cases they are borrowing, and we're going to see, trying to change some of what the four Gospels had said. But we also have accounts from non-Christians, and those are given to us in some of the historical records that date back all the way back, really, to the first century. Let's look first at the Gospels. Now, the Gospels spoke with apostolic authorship. And here's the testimony of Publius. He is, according to tradition, a disciple, or at least somebody who had passed on that which he had heard from the Apostle John. And he says in one of his early writings, now we don't have the writing, we have it from Eusebius, a church historian from a few hundred years later, and he's relating the tradition of Papias, and he says that Matthew indeed composed the saying, that is the Gospel of Matthew, in the Hebrew language. Now, we don't have it in the Hebrew language. All we have is in Greek, and notice, and each one interpreted them to the best of his ability. Of course, that begs the question, did Matthew himself give a Greek translation, or is what we have translated from the Hebrew and by somebody else? And the answer is we don't know. He goes on to say, this is still Papias and still via Eusebius, when Mark became the interpreter of Peter, he wrote down accurately whatever he remembered, though not in order. Notice he's saying that Mark isn't necessarily all in chronological order, that there might be a topical orders to some of the events there of the words and deeds of the Lord. Next, we have the testimony of Ignatius. Now, Ignatius is in the early 2nd century. He's really the next generation after the apostles, and he is the bishop at Antioch. And he writes saying, look, I don't have the same kind of authority as the apostles do. Not as Peter and Paul did, do I command you. They were apostles. I'm a convict. And when he says he's a convict, that doesn't mean he's a criminal. It means that he's been arrested and he's being taken to Rome to stand trial for being a Christian. He's going to be put to death. But he says, they were free. I, even to the present time, am a slave. I don't put myself on the same level as the apostles. And this is, notice, this is at the early 2nd century. Irenaeus, now he's a bit later. Irenaeus is at the end of the 2nd century. Matthew also issued among the Hebrews a written gospel in their own language, while Peter and Paul were evangelizing in Rome and laying the foundation of the church. After their departure, that's after their death, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, also handed down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. And so notice he's saying that Mark's information came not because Mark was necessarily an eyewitness, but that he had written under Peter's authority, sort of like being deputized by Peter. He goes on to say that Luke, also the companion of Paul, set down in a book the gospel preached by him. So Luke has talked about how he has researched and things like that, but also that he's writing under the authority of Paul. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord who reclined at his bosom, notice how he makes John the one who writes the Gospel of John, also published the gospel while he was residing at Ephesus in Asia. Still in Irenaeus, there is such certainty surrounding the Gospels that the heretics themselves bear witness to them. And starting from the Gospels, each one of them attempts to establish his own doctrine. The early heretics of the 2nd century, notice they weren't out writing their own Gospels yet. They were trying to take the Gospels that were already there. And he says the Ebionites, using only the Gospel of Matthew, are confuted by it when they make false suppositions concerning the Lord. The Ebionites were those that were saying Jesus was just a man. Let's just go and keep the law and try to keep some of the teachings of Jesus. And of course, when they did that, they were refuted by the very book that they tried to use to that end. He says Marcion's a 2nd century heretic who mutilates that of Luke. Marcion actually had tossed out all of the Old Testament and all 4 Gospels except portions of the Gospel of Luke. But notice, is proved a blasphemer of the only existing God by those parts which are still retained. Apparently he didn't throw out enough. And those parts that he kept still gave testimony against his teachings. He goes on, those who follow Valentine, making copious use of the Gospel of John to illustrate their conjugation, will by that very Gospel be proved to have said nothing rightly. So even the heretics gave testimony to the truthfulness of the 4 Gospels. Now Tertullian, writing around the same time, maybe just a little later, he says the same authority of the apostolic churches will defend the other Gospels which we possess through them, and because of their using them, I mean the Gospels of John and Matthew, while that issued by Mark may be affirmed to be Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was, and the digest by Luke, men are accustomed to ascribe to Paul. So notice the various church fathers are saying that the Gospels did have apostolic authority. Some because they were eyewitnesses like Matthew and John, some because they were connected and deputized by apostles like Mark and Luke. Now, there's a difference between the exact words of Jesus and the authentic voice of Jesus. And you say, wait a minute, is that double talk? Well, when we look at the parallel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, sometimes there are variations in the statements that are made. When we're looking, Jesus said, and you say, well, did he say this? Or suddenly the wording is slightly changed, but sometimes slightly, but significantly changed. And this is answered when we realize that these are summary statements. This is a summarization of what Jesus said. It's not, quote unquote, where you have him on the record saying these exact words. Remember, they didn't have tape recorders back then. We don't even call them tape recorders anymore. I'm showing my age, back when they actually used tape. But they didn't have recording devices, and they weren't saved uploaded to the internet. Rather, these are summary statements that are given. And so what we have is I think the authentic voice of Jesus, remembering that oftentimes these are translated from what would have been a different language, from the Aramaic language. So what we have is what Jesus said, but it comes to us from translation. And of course, most of us aren't reading it, not even in Aramaic, but we're not even reading in Greek as a rule. Most of us are reading through a English translation. You're hearing my words right now in English. And we try to go back a step, sometimes by studying Greek and Hebrew and things like that, and understanding that. And to be fair, there are a few times where the gospel account will give us the Aramaic, will actually give us the exact words, and then interpret it for us so that we understand what that means, because the original readers could not read Aramaic either. The authors sometimes they bring out additional theological implications. For example, when Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up." And we say, oh, goodness, so you and what building crew? And then John, this is in John chapter 2, he inserts, but Jesus spoke of the temple of his body. And I'm so glad that he added that, or else we would have those who would be thinking, oh, gee, Jesus has to rebuild some sort of future physical temple. We don't have to take that because Jesus explained, or John explained those words for us. Now, we also have non-Christian accounts of Jesus. I want to go in that direction and look at some of those for a few minutes. Josephus, he is a first century historian, late first century, and in his Antiquities, it has a paragraph saying, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was Christ, and remember, that's just the word for Messiah. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, because the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the sect of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Now, this paragraph in Josephus has come under a lot of fire from the skeptics, saying Josephus couldn't have written that. That must have been inserted by a later Christian who put words in his mouth. And I have several things to say about that. First of all, Josephus, every copy of Josephus that we have contains this. So it's not like it's missing in some copies and it's there from others. Secondly, I have to say, because when you first read this, you think, well, Josephus must have been a Christian. Anybody who wrote this was obviously a Christian. And that's not necessarily true. Josephus oftentimes would report on what had been said about this person or that person as if it was true. Even though it's evident from the context that he doesn't necessarily hold to that. He's just reporting, this is the story that's been told. And I think it's entirely possible that Josephus, who himself is not a Christian, there's no evidence that he was even remotely a Christian, but he had heard of them, and he reports about Christians, what Christians had said about Christians as to what is their belief, not necessarily that he's been impacted by that in any way. Not only does he speak about Jesus, we also have a segment that speaks about John the Baptist. And this is very highly connected to the context. In this section, Josephus is explaining some things that happened with Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great, and how he was attacked by the king of Arabia and some things that had taken place. And in that context, Josephus says, now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army, that is the army of Herod Antipas, came from God, and that very justly as a punishment of what he did against John that was called the Baptist. For Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness toward one another, and piety toward God, and to come to baptism, for that the washing would be acceptable to him if they made use of it, not in order to the putting away of some sins, but for the purification of the body, supposing still that the soul was thoroughly purified beforehand by righteousness. Notice he's saying that John said, get yourself right and then come and be baptized, which really sounds very much like what John said, both in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. Now he continues. Now, when many others came in crowds about him, for they were very greatly moved by hearing his words, Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion. We're told, at least according to Josephus, that Herod Antipas feared that John the Baptist could lead up a revolt against him. For they seemed ready to do anything he should advise, thought it best by putting him to death to prevent any mischief he might cause, and not bring himself into difficulties by sparing a man who might make him repent of it when it would be too late. Now, notice we don't have quite the same story as to the things leading up to his death that are found in the Gospels. Josephus is giving us sort of a summary statement. Accordingly, he was sent as prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus. Machaerus is a fortress on the east side of the Dead Sea. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they don't mention where John was held, only that he was in prison. According to Josephus, that is Machaerus fortress, the citadel I before mentioned, and was there put to death. So Josephus actually adds some details. If they're accurate, he adds some details that are not mentioned in the gospel accounts. It gives us extra details to the story. Now, the Jews had an opinion that the destruction of this army was sent as a punishment upon Herod and a mark of God's displeasure to him. Notice that statement started the story, the John the Baptist story in Josephus, and it also summarizes. So that serves as bookends to the John the Baptist account. Now, still on John the Baptist, and he says, now the report goes that this oldest Ananias, Ananias is the high priest, proved a most fortunate man, for he had 5 sons who had all performed the office of a high priest to God, and who had himself enjoyed that dignity a long time formerly, which had never happened to any other of our high priests. But this younger Ananias, who, as we have told you, already took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who were very rigid in judging offenders above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. When therefore Ananias was of this disposition, he thought he now had a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus, these are Roman procurators, and Albinus was but upon the road. And notice he's saying that Ananias, this high priest, had sort of taken some additional authority to himself, because the Roman procurator had died in office, and another one was on his way but hadn't taken office. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So we have, notice, this is something that the New Testament doesn't talk about. How did James die? James, the brother of Jesus. And so, and by the way, notice that Josephus refers to the Christ, but he's not really going to go into detail here. He's already introduced him earlier, and that assumes he had introduced him earlier because he just mentions him here. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens and such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king, and by the king they're referring to Agrippa. Agrippa is the grandson of Herod the Great, desiring him to send to Ananus that he should act so no more, for what he had already done was not to be justified. You see, the Jews didn't have authority to put somebody to death, and the fact that he had done so really put them on the outs with Rome. Nay, some of them went also to meet Albinus, remember the coming procurator, as he was upon his journey from Alexandria, and informed him that it was not lawful for Ananus to assemble a Sanhedrin without his consent. Whereupon Albinus compiled with what they said, and wrote in anger to Ananus, and threatened that he would bring him to punishment for what he had done, on which King Agrippa took the high priesthood from him when he had ruled but 3 months, and made Jesus, this is a different Jesus, it was a common name, son of Damnaeus, high priest. And so notice we've got some of the behind the scenes, for us behind the scenes, because we hadn't read about this in the New Testament. It was actually very much in front of the scenes. It was very much known to the public, these actions that were taking place. Now, a different historian, that was all Josephus. Here's another historian, Publius Cornelius Tacitus. Tacitus is living a bit after Josephus. He lives and writes at the end of the 1st and beginning of the 2nd century. He is a senator, and he writes what are known as his annals that begin with Tiberius. Tiberius is the emperor after Octavius Augustus. Tiberius was the emperor who was emperor when Jesus was crucified, and he ends with the death. He ends with the death of Nero. Consequently, he says, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt. This is the report of the fire at Rome. A rumor had started that Nero had started the fire. Probably not true. But in any case, to get rid of the report, Nero is starting to get blamed for this big fire in Rome. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. So here is Tacitus bearing witness to Christians in Rome in the days of Nero. You say, well, where did these Christians come from? Well, it's sort of evident where they came from. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Notice that Tacitus is not a fan of Christianity or of Christian religions or any other religions. He's thoroughly Roman, and yet he bears testimony that that he lived, that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate. He gives us quite a few historical details that had come down to him in his day. Now, I want to turn finally to some of the details in the Gospels. You see, we can look at details sometimes, and we have 2 different descriptions. For example, Matthew talks about the cursing and withering of the fig tree, and he describes them at the same time. Mark tells us that the cursing takes place, and that it's the next day that the tree is withered. Matthew is therefore compressing the event. He's not really mentioning a time element. He's just saying it happened. He doesn't say, and that same very day, but he's describing it all as being in one day. Another example is the daughter of the synagogue official who is healed by Jesus. Notice Matthew's account. My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live. Mark and Luke, Mark says, my little daughter is at the point of death. Now, remember, this is a summary statement. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she will get well and live. Had she died? Was she on the point of death? Maybe at some point during the process, she had gone from uh, from on the point of death to actually dying. And actually, Mark and Luke explain the story that way. And then Luke's account, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. But by the time she gets there, by the time Jesus gets there, the people are saying, now she has died. The centurion and his servant, remember, the centurion sends word to Jesus. And we read in Matthew's account, a centurion came to him, imploring him, and saying, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. When we read Luke's account, we read not that he went himself, but when he heard about Jesus, that he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come and save the life of his son. Furthermore, when Jesus is on the way, he sends others to say, no, you don't need to come. I'm a man under authority. I understand authority. Just say the word. So Matthew has him coming. Luke has him using intermediaries to come. It's a little bit like if I pick up a telephone and I call a friend and we have a conversation, and then I tell you after the fact, oh yeah, I talked to so-and-so, and it sounds like that I met up with him, not that I necessarily used the telephone as an intermediary, or that I sent word over the internet and that was the way we had our conversation. And so we have to understand that and not read too much into the text. Now notice one person verses 2. In Matthew, we read, when Jesus came to the other side of the country of the Gadarenes, 2 men who were demon-possessed met him as they were coming out of the tomb. In the parallel passage, Mark chapter 5, he says when he got out of the boat, immediately a man only describes one. Doesn't say there was only one, but the focus, the camera angle, as it were, if we were making a movie of this, the camera is only on one person, not on both of them. And so we'll have that oftentimes take place where there's 2 or maybe even more people, but our focus is only upon one of them. Another place where this takes place, Matthew describes 2 blind men sitting by the road, hearing that Jesus was passing by, cried out, Lord, have mercy on us, son of David. Whereas Mark says as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road. Mark doesn't mention there was somebody else sitting next to Bartimaeus, because that's not significant to him. Maybe, now, why is Bartimaeus mentioned by name? Maybe because after his vision was restored, he became a believer and maybe part of the church, and maybe his name was able to be passed down. I can't say for sure, and I don't want to speculate too much, but Matthew mentions 2 and Mark mentions 1, and they still both work together. They're telling the story 2 different ways, and this is really fundamental to the point, is that 2 authors do not independently tell the same story. And so when there are differences, that's not bad. That's actually good. That's speaking to their independence, at least to a certain degree. I think there are times when we've already talked about Mark and priority, and how Matthew seems to quote Mark at times and Luke seems to quote Matthew and Mark. And I think that's true, but they are still telling the story themselves. Now, sometimes it's the ordering of events. For example, when we're looking at the temptations of Jesus. Matthew chapter 4, describing the temptation. The first temptation is turn the stones into bread. The second temptation, jump from the pinnacle of the temple. The third temptation, Satan takes Jesus to a high mountain and says, the kingdoms are yours if you worship me. In Luke's account of the same temptations, notice the order is changed slightly. First, the stones are turned to bread. That's the same. But then he is led up, and the kingdoms are yours if you worship me. And then finally, jump from the pinnacle of the temple. Well, which happened first? You see, evidently, one of these is maybe in more, and maybe it's true of both, but at least one of these is more topically arranged. And Luke, in particular, likes to have his emphasis about the temple. So maybe Luke is giving us topically so that he can put the temple last, because that's really where he wants to go with this. Perhaps that's one possibility. But we have very often a topical instead of a chronological ordering, and we ought to remember that. Here's another example of ordering of events where Matthew speaks of how Jesus came to his hometown and began teaching them in the synagogue. Mark talks about he comes into his hometown when the Sabbath came, he began teaching in the synagogue. Luke's account takes place much earlier. I don't know about much earlier, but somewhat earlier in the ministry of Jesus, where he comes to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, and as was his custom, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath. Now, I'm assuming, maybe incorrectly, but I'm assuming these are describing the same events, but not necessarily placing them at the same. Notice how it places at different points in the ministry of Jesus. All during his ministry in Galilee, they all agree to that. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not necessarily arrange their events all in chronological order. There are times when you'll have more of a topical order, and that's okay. We understand that. Here's another example. Now, this one is at least to me, a little bit more problematic, where you have the event where Jesus goes in and cleanses the temple. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke place that at the end of the ministry of Jesus because they're placing only one visit to Jerusalem, and they're only describing it at the end of the ministry of Jesus. In the Gospel of John, we find out that Jesus had been to Jerusalem a number of different times throughout his ministry, that he comes to Jerusalem and he goes Samaria and Galilee, and then back to Jerusalem and back to Galilee and back to Jerusalem, and he's back and forth a number of times. So that John places the cleansing of the temple at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. Now, that's quite a difference. Still not overwhelming if we understand the Gospels are not necessarily written in chronological order. And if you're going to talk about the cleansing of Jerusalem, you have to talk about a time when Jesus is in Jerusalem, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke are only doing that at the end of the ministry of Jesus. So that's possible, although it's also possible that Jesus did it twice. Which is it? And my answer is, I don't know. I don't know. It's possible that he did it twice, but also possible that we have, maybe it happened not at the end, but maybe at the beginning, or vice versa. I don't want to suggest one has to be our answer. It's okay to look at something like this and say, here are the possible answers, and we're not sure which is the correct one. Now, as I said, there are events that happen twice. I gave that as a possibility with the cleansing of the temple. But here we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all speak of the feeding of the 5,000. But Matthew and Mark also speak of a different instance where Jesus feeds a different group of people, again, miraculously, the 4,000 this time. And notice if it had only been Luke and John that spoke of the feeding of the 5,000 and Matthew and Mark that fed the 4,000, we'd say, it was the numbers were probably like 4,500, and one rounded it up and the other rounded it down, instead of realizing that no, it happened. A similar event happened on two different occasions. Here's another example. Jesus stills the storm. This is when he's in the boat with his disciples and he's asleep in the boat. Matthew, Mark, and Luke each describe this. But Matthew, Mark, and John describe an event where Jesus comes to them walking on the water. He's not asleep in the boat. He's not sleepwalking. They're in the boat. The storm comes up and he comes walking on the water to them. Now notice that Matthew and Mark describe both of these events. Again, we would think, was he asleep or was he walking? If all we had was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but not Matthew and Mark telling both stories, we would be a little puzzled how to put these together, instead of realizing they are two different events. They're events that actually happen with variations. One where Jesus was asleep on the boat, in the boat, one where he's walking on the water and approaches them that way. Here's another event where we have Jesus calling Andrew, Peter, James, and John. This is in Matthew and Mark. In Luke's account, Luke gives additional details where Jesus has come and gotten into Peter's boat, and he has been preaching from the boat to the crowds that are assembled on the shore. And then after that, and after there's a miraculous catch of fish. Jesus then calls Andrew, Peter, James, and John, and they leave everything and follow him. Now, it looks to me like that first instance, Jesus calling Andrew, Peter, James, and John in Matthew and Mark, and the event in Luke where he calls them after preaching from the boat, it looks like that's the same event. But then when I come to John, we see Andrew, who's a brother to Peter, but he's also a disciple of John the Baptist. And John the Baptist says, there's Jesus, and Andrew begins to follow, and then he goes and gets his brother Peter and brings him to Jesus. First of all, that sounds like a separate event. I really think it is a separate event, where we find out that Andrew and Peter had already known Jesus and even followed him for a time. And then after that, Jesus calls them after having preached from the boat and when they were fixing their nets after a big catch of fish, and they leave those things and follow him. So we actually have two different events described in we have that which is described by John and that other event described by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And these are events that happen twice. I think that Luke's account actually suggests this already. The reason I say this is because when you have, you actually have some evidence when you read those accounts that Peter already knew Jesus, and that's found in Luke. And so I think this all does work nicely. Some other events that I think may have happened twice, and here I'm not entirely sure, where you have Jesus is anointed with expensive perfume by a woman in the house of Simon the leper. This is in Matthew and in Mark, and those two accounts are quite similar. In Luke chapter 7, now notice Matthew 26 and Mark 14, that's at the end of the ministry of Jesus. This is just before his death, burial, and resurrection. But Luke 7, this is taking place earlier in the ministry of Jesus, if it is in chronological order. And he is anointed in the house of Simon. So notice both of these take place in the house of Simon. But this time she is mentioned as a sinful woman. And then in the Gospel of John, again at the end of the ministry of Jesus, we have Mary mentioned. In Matthew, actually none of these other accounts do we have the woman's name mentioned. But in John 12, it is Mary who anoints Jesus with perfume. So this sounds at the very least like Matthew, Mark, and John are speaking of the same event of Mary coming and anointing the feet of Jesus. Is this the same or different than the anointing that Luke mentions? Is Mary the sinful woman, or is she a different instance? And notice I've put this under the category of events that happened twice. I think possibly this took place on two different occasions, but maybe not. Maybe that's not the answer. And so again, I don't want to be too dogmatic on that. Some other events that happened twice. Jesus, notice, heals two blind men in Galilee, and they say, "Have mercy on us, son of David." This is still in Matthew, so Matthew's recording both of these. Jesus heals two blind men at Jericho, where they say essentially the same thing, "Have mercy on us, son of David." But Matthew records both events. So he's describing these events that happened twice. And then when we get to Mark and Luke, and in both those cases, that's toward the end of the ministry of Jesus. That again, it's in Jericho, where Jesus heals Bartimaeus at Jericho, and we've already noticed. But a second person isn't mentioned. But that's okay; it doesn't have to be. "Have mercy, son of David." So again, these are events that look like they did. We can say, I think, pretty much definitively they happened twice. The Last Supper. And now we're coming to a very interesting one, in that Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to describe the Last Supper as a Passover. And yet when we come to the Gospel of John, we read at the trial of Jesus, this is after the Last Supper, this is actually the next morning, that Caiaphas and the Jews do not enter the praetorium, the place where where Pilate is located, where he is staying, at least in Jerusalem for that time. He didn't usually live in Jerusalem. But they did not enter the praetorium so that they might eat the Passover, which means that they're going to eat the Passover later on that day, maybe that night. And then by explanation, it was the day of preparation for the Passover. Well, was that the day of the preparation for the Passover, or had the Passover been the night before? And in this, it's interesting that the Dead Sea Scrolls actually give a hint as to what might possibly be the answer. And with the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have to remember that the folks that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were Jewish people, but they were separate, very separated, and they were not fans of what was going on in Jerusalem and the way that the Sadducees and the other Jewish people kept the traditions. They thought they weren't stringent enough. And in one of their writings, they actually talk about how those Jewish leaders in Jerusalem are showing how wrong they are by occasionally changing the day on which this or that observance might take place. Some of the observances, they would actually fiddle a little bit with the date. Now, they don't specifically mention the Passover, but the fact that they mention some of the other Jewish feasts where they would conveniently change the date if there was an issue, and sometimes there'd be an issue of having a day where you didn't do anything, and then the Sabbath right next to it. And so they would spread that out a little bit. That seems to have been the issue, and possibly that was the case here with the Passover as well. So that's one possibility: is that you had essentially two different days where, depending on how observant someone was, whether they went along with the more convenient date change or were more traditional, two different days where they might legitimately be said to have been observing the Passover. And I think that's possibly the answer to the issue here.